morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and we are coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, I've been thinking about the last few shows, and while I think we've done a pretty good job of covering kind of the breadth of the market and what's going on, both from a big picture perspective, point in time perspective, I feel like sometimes one of the things that people tune in for is they really kind of want to know, okay, that's all cool and everything, but what about the day-to-day stuff that we deal with every day, the things that, you know, the bulk of the people in our organization are dealing with. And so today we're going to dig into some stuff that everybody, at least the majority of people, use every day. And if you're not using this variant of it, you are using another variant, but it's a very everyday, use it every day, be productive with it every day, AI workload, AI use case. And we're going to dig into that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Sharegate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. Sharegate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. And we're back. And folks, you know, as we mentioned in the shifting of the name to Enterprise AI, I don't think there is a more enterprise-centric sort of use case that everybody deals with on a regular basis than Microsoft 365 and what we do around email and collaboration and those sorts of things. And, you know, as more and more of the workflows that we're working on become agentic, become at least agentic or AI, kind of agentic adjacent, if you will, say that 3 times fast, it's really, really important for us to start thinking about what are the governance things that we need to keep in place? What are the security things we need to keep in place? And probably just as importantly, how do we start educating our users in the same way that we've been educating them about phishing scams and all sorts of stuff for decades about what this new AI thing means, both in terms of productivity, but also in terms of keeping the company safe. And so very, very excited to have Richard Harbridge join us today. He runs strategic alliances and strategy for Sharegate, one of our good partners. Richard, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We're going to dive into all these things. You and I have been having some good conversations before we hit the record button. But before we do that, give us a little bit of your background and then really kind of the areas that you focus on in trying to help Sharegate customers remain safe and productive at the same time.
Sure. You know, most of my career has been about helping these orgs get more value from Microsoft 365 one way or another. And the main goal is to do that without letting complexity overwhelm IT. And so what's interesting is that the labels keep changing, right? So one year it's migration. You know, you got these big migration projects and modernization projects. And then it's governance. Then it's adoption, you know, Copilot adoption, things like that. Then it's AI readiness. But underneath, you know, the work overlaps. Permissions, ownership, lifecycle, content quality, visibility, change management, it's all the same. And, you know, that's why I like the work I do at Sharegate. So we help IT teams understand what they have, reduce that complexity, govern Microsoft 365 in a way that makes AI adoption safer and more sustainable. And so my perspective comes from, you know, a few places, right? A former CTO, a Microsoft MVP of many, many, many years, industry advisor at Sharegate, and, you know, 200,000 people, you know, use that tool. So there's a lot of this community of these Microsoft 365 IT professionals who know way more than I do that I get to hear from and learn from through interviews and surveys and research and that sort of thing. So hopefully I'll be able to share a little bit of that today.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I feel like anytime we get a chance to talk to folks who have a long history of, you know, being Microsoft MVP and doing some stuff, really the thing that we're sharing is just, you know, your scars and scrapes and things that you want to help people avoid dealing with. So let's start with sort of a big question or just sort of broad topic. You know, generative AI, how has it changed the definition of governance inside Microsoft 365? There are Copilot type of capabilities built in, but we also are seeing people begin to bring an agent, bring a Claude, bring an open claw. Walk me through the mindset that you're starting to have to talk to people about as they think about governing these environments and just understanding what could happen that they're not really thinking about yet.
I change my narratives all the time for governance, right? As we all do. But my current one that I'm loving is this idea that governance used to be treated as the brakes, right? Mm-hmm. Stop. In the AI era, I think it's becoming more like traction control. It's the only way to keep traction as you go fast.
Yeah.
It's not there to stop the car. It's there to help you move faster without losing control. And I think that's a big part of it. I think if I was to split this into two ways today, how is AI changing governance? I'd say first is that governance is moving from this thing that many people saw as a tax on IT to something that directly affects AI confidence, speed, and scale. So, if your content, your access ownership, your life cycle, if those things aren't in good shape, well, AI is not going to hide that. It often makes it much more visible and directly impacts it. And, that's interesting too, because if we think about the numbers, again, like 78% of organizations are saying like governance is the key from an AI perspective that drives, a lot of that success. We can look at like the big concerns that CFOs have, right? One is reliability of the data, data quality. The other one is this risk aversion with AI as they scale. And both of those things are governance is your lever to solve that.
Yeah.
I think that's the first one. The second one is this idea that governance is becoming more continual. And that's really important. So in the past, we had a little bit of governance work in this project. Think of a migration has, some governance where you're trying to reconcile that. You might have a cleanup, a compliance push, a restructuring, et cetera. But AI readiness isn't this one and done thing. In fact, I think the term AI readiness is really tricky, right? Because people are like, oh, I'm AI ready, or I was last year. But are you now, right? As we have digital workers, as we have these changes, as people use these tools in more complex ways, the org changes, all these things change. So, as teams restructure, new sites get created, content, gets shared in new ways, guests come and go. That means that just like AI readiness is continual, so does governance. And again, think of like a Venn diagram, migrations, modernization, AI readiness, AI governance, governance of Microsoft 365. All these things are, becoming more and more of circles that sit on each other than Venn diagrams. Like the work you're doing is affecting each of those. And so again, I think the definition of governance itself is expanding. It's not a policy. It's this operating model that, keeps your Microsoft 365 environment, the data, the content, the usage, the patterns of it, AI safe and trustworthy. And I think that's critical because we all want to go faster, right? More is definitely on the radar.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. Obviously, like compliance in the past, and I'm going to oversimplify this, and people who do this all the time are going to be like, no. But you think about compliance as something that maybe you had to do quarterly, right? It was like, hey, we an auditor might come in at some point in time. We might be releasing public numbers for the quarter or something. So you had a time frame you had to sort of work around. With AI moving so fast, what is when you say it's sort of this constant governance or an ongoing governance? What's the mindset that has to change, and what are some of the sort of task-based things that people have to think about? Like, are you thinking about this now on a weekly basis, or on a monthly basis? Or are you thinking more like, what are these constant sort of tools or frameworks that have to be in place to keep up with what's going on, because stuff can change so much?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple ways to break it, right? One is to say like we have, and it's true, we have, most of us, a lot of legacy compliance, security, governance debt just accumulated. And these are, good decisions at the time, but they're just decisions after decision. And you've kind of stacked up. I kind of think of it visually like sediment. So, you have the sediment that builds year over year think of your technology stack, not even just Microsoft 365, right? All these mixed technologies, all this different stuff that you're throwing out there and adopting. We all know migration projects get pushed and, these consolidation projects get pushed. And so all of that stuff builds, and the debt has accumulated to a point now where I'm not saying it's all due, but the interest that you're paying on that sprawl, the interest that you're paying on that complexity, those levels of debt, that is getting so expensive now that you have to start investing in reducing it. And you have two levers to reduce it, right? So one is, proactive governance. It's the idea of, this governance ongoing initiative. The other one's consolidation. And so I don't want to underestimate that consolidation lever. A lot of organizations are just saying, well, let's just get rid of legacy. Let's get rid of half these other SaaS tools. Let's like really consolidate into M365 from Google and from, file shares and SharePoint Server and other tenants. So that is one way to do it. And that does help, because when you consolidate, you're reducing sprawl, which, makes it easier to apply, those rules, those, things like sensitivity policies and labels and things like that. Yeah. The second part to it, though, I think that a lot of people underestimate is that sediment, AI has to comb through it all. It has to dig through it. And so what we have to do is we have to find a way to recognize that it isn't going away, even if you do a massive amount of cleanup. And I've seen organizations do tremendous work using, especially Sharegate Protect and other tools to clean that up. Even once you've cleaned that up, you have to keep doing that, right? It's a continual thing. And I think people underestimate that, AI is this exponential technology. So what's going to happen is right now we're talking about users who have AI working on their behalf, often as digital assistants, doing, creating new content, sharing content, doing all sorts of things for them. But the reality is that's going to pivot soon, and we're going to have far more agents, far more digital worker identities doing all that work for people. And so as that scales, if you're already struggling to kind of maintain and keep pace with, the governance that AI demands, you're going to be in a much harder position. And so I think really we have this window right now where we can learn how to do this better, and we have to do that better so that the time we get to there, we're in a better position.
Yeah.
One last comment on that that I always think about is I think the other piece to this is that people really underestimate the complexity of governance. So we all talk about oversharing or things like that, but there's actually 11, just in Microsoft 365 terms, there's 11 types of sprawl. So you've got permission sprawl and sharing sprawl. You got configuration sprawl. Do you know there's 10,000 configurable values in M365? It's crazy. There's app and automation and agent sprawl. You have change and all the message center stuff, the change management sprawl. You have licensing sprawl. We have all these forms of sprawl, and every one of those things that I just mentioned, and all the ones I didn't mention, and user devices, et cetera, all of that sprawl adds to that governance load, right? That accumulates that debt that we were talking about. And so I think sometimes the other mistake people do is they kind of pick one part of governance and they frame all of governance as about that, like oversharing or something like that. And that really underestimates, not just the amount of work, but the value in doing a lot of that other, related work as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting. You talk about this sort of technical debt and it has its natural piling up, and then you have AI coming along, which is going to sort of accelerate that. The analogy that sort of immediately jumped to mind was the idea of when you're a young kid and you get a credit card and they start you off with sort of a teaser rate or something, and you're like, oh man, this is awesome, and all of a sudden it jumps from 6% to 20%, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I wasn't paying it off month to month, and all of a sudden the residuals become overwhelming, right? You don't know how to get out of it. So yeah, it does feel like we're at very much a moment which is going to be rushing past you really quickly, that it's like, if you don't get your house in order pretty quickly, it's going to overwhelm you. You guys just recently released some very interesting research talking about organizations that are reporting data exposures, but you talked a little bit about people kind of underestimating their readiness, or you kind of saying you feel like people are probably underestimating their readiness. What are you, when you see that type of stuff, in terms of the number of people reporting stuff, and then as you're talking to people, what do you think the real sort of readiness looks like? I mean, do you get the sense that it's a very small portion of people that, because they've actually played with it? Because I think that's really one of the big things with AI is you can research it a little bit, but until you're actually really dealing with it and sort of recognizing the learning curves or the failure curves, I don't think you totally get it. What's your sense from talking to people as to how well prepared they are or under prepared they are?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and I'll grab some data points that I think kind of accentuate this. So the first one, I think, is the biggest one, is that in organizations today. So again, I'm very privileged working with Sharegate. So Sharegate does these research surveys. They ask a number of different M365 leaders. This last one we just did was 850 plus IT and security leaders, and they basically said, "Hey," and this was last month. They said, do you think your M365 governance is supporting AI responsibly? Do you think it's AI ready? And 93% said yes. So I think we've got confidence, which is just a great signal in the market, right? A lot of people did a lot of work, hopefully, over the last while, kind of getting AI ready and things like that. But then those same people, 29% said AI tools already surface sensitive data that shouldn't have been accessed. So this is self-attested, so it's probably much higher. And then 8%, it's just probably the most alarming, didn't know. They just couldn't answer that question, right? They didn't have a way to get that visibility. Is it even doing what I just described?
Yeah.
And that's, arguably over a third, well over a third, that are basically saying here's we're really, really confident, but we're having this actually happen, right? These aren't just potential. These are exposure events that are happening. Now, again, do those all make the news? No. But if you think about it, there's some really interesting elements that play here, right? So you've got again, decisions that have been made many, many times over years. Many organizations just haven't dealt with inactivity and archiving and get rid of old data, which is both going to improve the Copilot, the AI experiences you're using, and also reduce some of this risk. Most people, 40% of IT leaders, they basically delay their Copilot rollout, typically 3+ months because of oversharing concerns. So again, it's not like it's not having some sort of impact today. And then, again, 81% of orgs have sensitive data exposed to employees, to all employees. And then again, 802,000 files are the average, I think, for, average risk of files in an org that are at risk. Many orgs have business critical data overshared. 27,000 sharing links is kind of the average. Again, we can break all the numbers down. So
Sure.
what I'm really saying is that, it is a very visible part of the discussion. Oversharing is something we all intuitively understand, and it's arguably the most visible part of this complexity, but it's actually not the main thing you're going to resolve, right? If you really want to if you want to solve the biggest risk, what you want to take all the sensitive information in your org, using Purview or other tools, and you want to make sure those are labeled. And so the question is why? Why are we struggling to label? I won't even show the data there because it's even more alarming. Like the number of orgs that have, even labels, multiple labels applied to their data across the tenants that we get to manage and work with is very, very small. So what we have to acknowledge is that, the visible thing is oversharing, but the reason that oversharing is hard to manage or resolve is lack of visibility. Do we have the tools? Do we have the ability to prioritize which ones we want to clean up? Do we have a way to delegate and distribute that governance? Because again, IT is already overwhelmed. And then lastly, and this I think is important, to understand how it connects. So do we understand that just because we see something like everyone except external users, as just a SharePoint thing where everyone has access, that actually probably came because it was a collaboration space. And someone decided they wanted to share something in there with everyone in the org, and they chose a quick option at the time, which worked, but exposed everything inadvertently. And it wasn't visible, it wasn't a problem until, AI made it accessible and is making those judgment calls. So again, for a lot of organizations, because these are so interconnected, you have to look at, something like inactivity is a great example. You think, well, why does inactivity affect oversharing? Well, if it's older data, often the easiest thing to do instead of resolving the oversharing is just to archive it, to get rid of it from a concern perspective. Well, to do that, just something simple like inactivity, you have SharePoint activity levels, but then if it's a connected, which most are, it's a Teams, you have Teams channel and conversation activity. And so, if you just look at the SharePoint data and say, oh, it's inactive and you archive it, but then Teams breaks, right? Or there's other confusion there, this is what blocks and slows organizations down. It's this complexity is something that organizations operationally have to manage. And admins know what we're talking about, right? But they just didn't have the, budget or support before. And now because of AI, there is way more emphasis on that than before, which is great. And so now it's finally time to, start resolving this, not as a one-time thing, but as we mentioned, as a way to ongoing improve those experiences.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about users starting to experiment with agents or begin to build them into workflows, whether a SharePoint or a email or something is sort of center to it. What are you starting to see as far as, or what guidance are you giving organizations to rethink identity and access management? Because we're going to start to get into workflows where you might be thinking, well, this is Richard's agent, so therefore it should reuse your same credentials. But at the same time, you start to get into things like, well, is that then sort of impersonating you? Should it be Richard-agent 1? What are you seeing in terms of what people are experimenting with, or what are you seeing in the platforms to sort of start to deal with this? Because we're going to get into a point very quickly where it won't just be a one-to-one of like Richard to Richard's agent. It'll be Richard and his swarm of agents, of which you may not even necessarily know that you are, kind of overseeing all of those things if we get into these swarms and so forth.
Yeah, look, there's a separate discussion here, which is, do users have the ability to validate, as AI becomes more and more opaque and wizardy and does magic for them? Like, do they even know, how to validate what it's
exactly
being used?
Exactly.
But I think that, this idea of identity is really important. I think it's probably the most important AI conversation as we go on for a governance perspective, because historically we would always ask, like, who's the user and what can they access, right? And now we need to ask, what's acting on their behalf and what data can it reach and what tools can it invoke and can it write, delete, send, approve, or trigger a workflow? What are those workflows? How do we get visibility on that? Is the access temporary or persistent, and who reviews it? And this is one of those things that you may say, well, of course we need to do all those things. And, Microsoft has Agent 365 and we have these digital worker identities and we'll have, the Entra or Azure AD battle that happened way back. And Microsoft had to win that identity in the cloud, and they did, win that in the enterprise. And now we have this big battle, which is who's going to win arguably the identity of agents in the cloud. And Microsoft really wants to win that. And as a shareholder, I hope they win it. But, that discussion, it really comes down to, why is that so important? And it's important because, and I think the easiest way to think about this is think of your own use. When you, and everyone does this, when you start to use these agents that are acting on your behalf, right? They have their own identities. Most people, they start to say, yeah, always approve this, always approve that. And again, that agent is going to work on your behalf. It's not going to go, hey, do I still need access to that thing? Maybe I should revoke my access, right? Like the sprawling nature of this is that it's going to exponentially increase the complexity of those underlying things that we were talking about earlier, your data governance, your content governance, workspaces and all that stuff. So I think that's really important. And often when we talk about identity, we think about like, how do we just get it onboarded in that ecosystem, which is important, right? I want Agent 365. I want tools to be able to understand it, whichever tools you're using. But even if I have that visibility and I start to see, oh, these are the MCPs, these are the tools they're using, you have sort of a top-down agent governance and identity governance, and then you have a bottom-up, you have a resource-based, approach where you need to do that. And again, I think of those two, the resource one is actually easier for us to wrap our heads around and get further ahead, because this top down, we're still figuring it out, right? If we're being honest, the agent, how does this agent have a relationship to this one? What's the hierarchy of those? A lot of these are newer experiences that we're working through. We have ideas, but we don't know until we kind of see how this evolves. And that's really month to month. It's going very, very quickly. And so again, I like to think of where's that stability? Where's that area where we know those investments are paying off? And I think of that resource, up approach as being the place that needs the biggest emphasis. And yeah, one resource is identities and how we manage that with these digital workers. But I think, that's the one that needs more attention right now versus just the speculation of, how this mixed agent identity experience will work in 2 years from now versus what it looks like today.
If you were sitting down with, reasonably experienced M365 customer, their innovation is sort of important to them, but security is obviously important to them. They're not building the latest and greatest Silicon Valley startup where, it's just sort of burned through everything, but they want the business to be around for a long time. Like what is good AI governance as of, May 2026? What does that look like operationally? How would you sort of sit down with them and say, look, this is where we need to get you to. This is how you should evaluate where you are. What does that look like from a bigger picture perspective? And we could probably go on for multiple hours around that. But, if you had 5 minutes, 10 minutes with somebody and you were trying to give them a big picture, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, as we mentioned, it's continual, but, an easy way to frame it, and there's so many ways we could frame it, but the easiest way I can think of to frame it is find, fix, prevent, right? So, we need a continual way to find. So that means visibility, however you want to describe that, right? Awareness. You need to know where the sensitive content is. Where is the oversharing? Where is the stale workspaces? Where is the ownerless content and sites? Yeah, risky access patterns, unmanaged AI use, all that stuff. So that's like the find. And you'd think that the find is one of the easier things to do today. Microsoft has great native tools, but it's actually where you need to do a lot of scripting, a lot of, scaffolding, or you need to use, third-party tools like Sharegate. So I think find is really important. Once you feel like you've figured out the find part of it, again, based on all these different areas, then you got to work on fix. Now, fix means you remediate. So that's important because you don't want to turn everything into a massive project. We need quick and easy, or even potentially, if not autonomous, like very automated ways to do those fixes. So, can we review access, assign ownership, archive stale content, sites, workspaces, et cetera? Can we remove risky links? Can we involve business owners, and can we make, certain decisions on our own without needing anyone's involvement, because they're, recoverable and there's audited and tracked, and so on and so forth. So that fix part is really about, I think, operational efficiency. It's saying like, how do we do this faster and easier and in a way that's more reliable and recoverable? And I think for a lot of organizations, again, that's where native just doesn't meet your needs. So you're going to have to do something, scaffold some processes, some automations, or, use a mixture of tools like Sharegate. And then prevent, I think, is the last one. So if you've done those two things, you're finding and fixing things, now it becomes this idea of prevention. And this is where what we're looking for is some of these patterns, not all of them, but some of these patterns can be prevented. Like we can stop it from rebuilding again in the future. So that might be lifecycle policies. That could be safer defaults. Like, You have all these overshared sites with all these everyone in the org links. Well, that's the default in tenants. If you, unless you've changed it, that's the default. You should change that to like you choose who to share it with. That makes a big difference because now the default is people name some people, and now it's only shared with those people. So the exposure risk is much lower. As an example, so that's owner education, templates, guardrails, reporting, regular review. And that's where I think this idea of perceiving governance not as a risk mitigation thing is important. It's not that it doesn't mitigate risk, but that's not actually its main focus. Governance is more about efficiency. It's like team sport, right? So, I have young kids, they play soccer, they run around, it's like mob ball, and they all just follow the ball. Well, right. When you start to add layering to that and you say, oh, we have an offensive line and a defensive line, and we have, positions on the field, and we have plays and playbooks, that team who's maybe talented is able to perform much better. But if everyone's kind of just reactively working through it, this way that most organizations do, then you're not optimizing that. So I think actually most governance, fits in that prevention model because so much of it is this idea of, scaffolding some teams, scaffolding some plays or playbooks, policies, those things that we do, which actually allows us to drive our usage of these tools like Microsoft 365, like Copilot to new heights, right? And I think that's, again, the best way to think about it. Use it as a lever for, it is your competitive advantage. I'll just land with one more thing. I really, really strongly believe this. You have two competitive advantages today if you're in IT. So either you're attaching your career to AI innovation. So you're building all those really cool agents and you're taking the process memory in the org and you're figuring out ways to improve and automate that and take it to the next level. So that's one area. The other area, I think, and it's huge, is that it's governance. And so that area is really saying you have IP. You have things that are generating process memory. Those could be documents. Those could be literally skills, right, is a new construct in AI world. So you're doing those things. What you should be doing is figuring out how do we do that at scale? How do we make that, more performant, safer? How do I find the best of that so that this innovation can innovate faster, more reliably, and get more benefit? And I would argue that innovation side, I don't know if that's a differentiated competitive advantage because if you have the latest models and we're all, we have enough capital, we're all kind of have the same advantage. But if you really maximize your people and you're maximizing the data they're outputting, right? And you're maximizing, the processes in your org, like those things are all in that governance category. And so I actually think the biggest place for long tail competitive differentiation and benefit, from one org to another is going to be these lowercase p processes. It's going to be, this work that you're doing on governance is going to be in that side of the business. So that's kind of how I think about that as well. Together, I think, find, fix, prevent, and, having the right mindset, efficiency, team sport, or that thing that I just mentioned, I think that's what leads one organization to outpace another and be in a better position a few years from now.
Yeah. Oh, it's good stuff. You covered a lot there, but I think, the bottom line of this is while the word governance or compliance for a long time has sort of felt like it's off to the side of what's going to differentiate the business. I think now that, we're moving into a world in which most likely you're going to give every one of your employees, definitely your most important employees, these tools to sort of have superhero skills to differentiate your business, to come up with new things, finding that right balance between enabling innovation, which we all sort of want, and we want it to run as fast as possible. But now knowing that those compliance layers and those guardrails and the places where you used to have firewalls and other stuff really has to be touching everybody and almost everything, that compliance and governance becomes really, really important to that Venn diagram. It's not just an afterthought. It's not like you said, it's not a once a quarter thing. It's this continuous thing. So I appreciate you kind of giving us that big picture. I think, like we said, we could have gone on for a very long time. I'll give you one sort of last thing. Any sort of immediate guidance or folks who are like, hey, obviously Richard knows what he's talking about. The folks at Sharegate know what they're talking about, this stuff. What's the best way to engage with the team if they're looking at their M365 environment and they're like, I'm not sure how prepared I am. I want to go fast. I've got this push from up top to engage AI. What's the best way to engage with the team, or what's the best way to just get started with this stuff?
I mean, definitely navigating this with friends matters, right? So podcasts like this that can educate you are really great. I would say, there's resources out there. So we have one of my favorite little resources we did is this checklist. So it has like 150 governance checklist items you can do. And that kind of gives you an idea of like, what is my gaps in M365 governance? Obviously we have a tool. So whether it's us or somebody else, going in, setting up a demo makes a big difference because you can kind of see how are they tackling it and why. Like why is there this scaffolding here that exists, and what does that tell us about native and where native is? First party Microsoft offerings there. So I think that's important as well. And then, this idea of doing it with friends is also important because, whether it's a vendor, whether it's a partner, whether it's, a great community, I think, this is all something we're navigating together, and it can feel very isolating and overwhelming. And so being able to have someone else say, here's a proven script, or here's a tool that, does X, Y, Z. And so you don't have to think about that part of it, or you can just kind of follow that wizard. That makes a big difference so that we can focus on those other areas that we have to navigate in our orgs. Like, yeah, these are all things we know how to do, but now I need to find the right way to, get that budget. I need to find the right way to make sure that I can perform this because I'm the one admin and it is what it is, right? And I have to do all this other stuff on top of that. So yeah, I would say start with some resources like that checklist or set up a demo and definitely reach out. We'll put some in the show notes. I imagine we'll put some links there for people as well.
Yeah, we'll absolutely put links in the show notes. No, I like that idea of do AI and governance with friends, and let SharePoint or let Sharegate be your friends in that analogy. Good stuff, Richard. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you coming on and sharing a bunch of knowledge with us, getting us. Like I said, this is probably the sort of enterprise AI tool that everybody's going to use, everybody's going to interact with in one way, shape, or form, and having a good framework to think about how do we make sure that it can really sort of live at that Venn diagram intersection of innovation and sort of security and governance is super important. So folks, with that, we want to thank Richard for his time. Thanks for his insight. We're going to wrap it up there. And thank you all for listening to the show every week. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow in this new space that we're evolving into. And so with that, we're going to wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.